Hey everyone, today we'll be discussing 10 facts about yeast. So what is yeast? Yeast is a fungus, number one. What is a fungus? A fungus survives by getting energy from eating other organisms. The second fact about yeast is that it works in the presence and in the absence of oxygen. So if you want it in the presence of oxygen, it's to be making vinegar. If you want it without oxygen, to make alcohol. The third fact about yeast is that it lives on water and on fruit surfaces. If you want to chop fruits like apples, for example, you can put it in your jar of rum and it'll ferment. The fourth fact about yeast is that the yeast cells die or get damaged once the alcohol concentration gets too high. So this is roughly 10 to 15% alcohol. And it's crazy because yeast produces alcohol. And once the alcohol is overbearing, then the yeast die. So it's like they're creating something that'll kill them. The fifth fact about yeast is that they stop growing once there's a depletion of nutrients and once their environmental conditions are not favorable. So we have something called turbo yeast. And so you're sure to never go wrong with turbo yeast because the nutrients are included in the package and it works along with the yeast. And for the second part, the unfavorable conditions, this can include your temperature being too hot, being too cold, there's too much sugar. So the optimal temperature to ferment is between 22 degrees Celsius and 27 degrees Celsius. If you exceed that, it might be too hot and the yeast might die. And if it's too cold, the yeast might become dormant and just sink to the bottom of the jar. The sixth fact about yeast is that no matter how much you add, there's a cap of the percentage of alcohol that you can obtain. So the cap is 20%. And some people think that the more sugar and the more yeast you add, you can bring it up to 40. No, this is wrong, wrong, wrong. The only way you can get your 20% alcohol to 40% is by the process of distilling, and this is illegal, unfortunately, in Canada. In order to do this, you're gonna need equipment that we do not have. And a little story, last time I did a batch, I thought that I had not put enough yeast, so I kept adding more and more and more, and the taste was horrible. It just tasted bitter. The seventh fact about yeast is that not all yeast are created equal. So they differ in alcohol tolerance. So if you get, for example, a bread yeast versus a wine yeast versus turbo yeast, you'll be getting different levels of alcohol depending on their capability to produce. The eighth fact about yeast is that yeast plays a role in flavoring alcohol. Once I thought I hadn't put enough yeast in my jar, so I kept adding, and I tasted it after the fermentation was done, and it's something that you wouldn't want to try, so I just threw the whole thing out. Unfortunately, it wasn't able to be saved, even with flavoring. The ninth fact about yeast is that the ability for yeast to perform depends on the temperature. So we talked about this earlier. If it's hotter or if it's colder, it's going to depend how happy your yeast is and how much sugar it's able to convert into alcohol. And the 10th fact about yeast is that once fermentation is over, it's just gonna sink to the bottom of the jar and you'll see a small layer of yeast at the bottom. It's pretty visible, and the longer you leave it in the jar, the darker it becomes. So initially it's light, maybe whitish, yellowish color. And if you leave it in the jar for a while, it becomes dark brown, the color of your rum. And I'm curious to see which yeast do you use? Do you use daddy yeast, angel yeast, turbo yeast, bread yeast, any other yeast? Just drop a comment below. And if you found this video valuable, like and subscribe.